Sam, if I could just turn to you and kind of abuse the chair's privilege. You're a great proponent of social prescribing. I wonder if you could just say a few words about both that, but also how you see gardens and gardening fitting into that, another social movement.
So I think I realised many years ago as a GP that I was missing something in terms of delivering healthcare to patients. And we know now that at least 70% of people's health and well-being is nothing to do with what you would expect me to do as a GP, which is around prescribing and referring. And at our centre in the East End of London, we have the contract. We run the park that we sit in, a 3-acre park, known by my East End patients as Dog Shit Green 20 years ago. You will recognise those places. Now a beautiful space where you'll see children playing, and you'll see somebody in a Zimmer frame sitting down and walking through the park. Now that is a rarity in inner city parks. So we have within our practice now the ability for all the GPs to refer to the social prescribing team. And the social prescribing team will spend an hour with them over a cup of coffee, usually in the centre, and talk to them about not what the matter is with them. That's how I was taught at medical school. That's what being a doctor was all about, but what matters to them. That's a very subtle change of wording, but it's very, very important when you think about how you're going to deliver a health and well-being. And they will potentially connect them to a whole raft of projects, 1,500 voluntary sector organisations in Tower Hamlets, gardening projects, allotments, a whole raft of different things which fundamentally will change their life. This actually came from an invitation I had to speak to the National Gardening Scheme, which I don't know why you invited me, George, but I gave a presentation about social prescribing, and there was something that hit me so strongly in the room. Now, I work as a GP in the East End of London. A 40-year-old woman typically has become virtually housebound, is overweight, is depressed, is osteoarthritic, is unhappy. What I saw in that room was people far older, but looking far younger, happy, healthy, and not overweight. And it was so obvious, it was so stark, and it was so stark a piece of evidence actually about the power of gardening and health. And on a personal level, my mother died last year, but she was aged 89, smoker all her life, and the only reason she survived all those years was her gardening. I'm utterly convinced of that. And so our ability, I think, in general practice, to give people those same opportunities is absolutely vital. In fact, we have a branch in the Cotswold now in Stanton, where we take people from the East End of London who have never been in a field or seen a cow or seen anything like that before. It's quite extraordinary, isn't it, in our society, how we have so many people, young and old, that have never tasted what so many of us take for granted. And by the way, this starts at the beginning of life too, because 5-year-old in Tower Hamlets, one of my patients, 50% vitamin D deficient, 11% obese, doubled by the age of 11. Quite shocking statistics. And even by the age of 5, their cognitive development, so their educational development, is 10% below the national average. All because they don't have the access to what a lot of us would consider normal in life. So this to me is just part of a journey for the King's Fund and for public health. I now, as chair of the CCG, have committed £240,000 to put social prescribing in every single practice, so it will be the norm for the GP. When you go into a GP in Tower Hamlets, you won't automatically get your naproxen or your referral to the orthopaedic surgeon. What you will get is what matters to you.
Thank you, Sam. We've got some time. Of course, the hands are already beginning to go up, so I think that the gentleman there was definitely first. We've got a mic coming around.
Thanks. Justin Varney from Public Health England. The report really highlights the evidence base of where the impact could be had, but I think there is a social discourse about gardening that still frames it as a middle-class pursuit. And when you talked about how much of an urban landscape is green spaces in private gardens, I think back to where I used to work in Barking and Dagenham, not far down the road from Sam, where we had large estates with very little green space. how does the panel think we can change the social discourse so that people who are furthest from enjoying gardens view this as part of their lives and something that they can access and they see as attainable, not something that they just see on TV or they go to visit on a special day out?
That's a great question. I might take another one at the same time to allow the panel time to think. Was there, do people have another one they wanted to raise? The lady here.
Thank you. It's Catherine Rossiter, Chief Executive of Thrive, and thank you very much for the kind references to Thrive by the speakers today. Just building on the previous speaker there, I just wanted to raise the question about the value of municipal parks to the wider population. We're all very much talking about how we can structure specific health interventions for specific people, but we mustn't miss out on the wider population benefit of having green spaces. And I wonder if anybody had any views on, excuse me, how we could work with local authorities, given that funding for park maintenance is being slashed all around the country.
So panel, a question around the wider green spaces and one particularly around social discourse and a link to inequalities. And
shall I pick up both of those? So in the report there is we do talk about inequalities and access. I think public parks and public spaces generally are really critical here, and there are some really innovative models around the country where people are given there are funding pressures, of course, but are being innovative about how they keep high quality green spaces. In particular, that's another issue, particularly around public parks. High quality green spaces are really critical, because if they're not high quality, people don't use them and they become dog shit green. So they are a scar on the landscape rather than something that people use and access. So there is some positive stories. So there are some local authorities doing really good work. I should say also that I don't think it's quoted here, but the National Trust is doing some really good work trying to think how do we keep sustainable public places, particularly in urban settings. I think obviously social prescribing is part of this, so actually this is mainstream. I also think that point I made there about reciprocity, about the fact that actually how can we support people through the generations connect through gardens, and how particularly can statutory services, local authorities, CCGs actually help that process, actually open some of the private spaces. And obviously the NGS is all about opening private spaces, but more private spaces to wider access. So I think there are many things that we can do, but definitely there is an issue, and we know that poorer people from minority ethnic groups tend to make less use, particularly of green spaces outside towns. I'm not so sure of the evidence inside towns. That's where the Healthy New Towns work, I think, could be really powerful here in taking this on. How do we design healthy new towns, or bits of new towns, so that we design this in from the start? So I think there are lots of things going on. So I'm always an optimist, whatever the environment, because I don't really want to pick up.
I just want to add that I think it is, as come up in the question and as Dave suggested in his speech, I think it's absolutely crucial to retain a balance between publicly owned green space and parks and gardens and privately owned. And you're quite right, Justin, there is that sense of private gardens they have a slightly possibly exclusive label, and I'm going to talk a bit about that in my speech. But I think what I would say about the National Garden Scheme, one of our real benefits is, if you think that in the 1980s we had 30 gardens within the inside M25 Greater London metropolitan area opening to visitors, and today we have over 300. I think what we're trying to do is provide these. We accept that not everybody can have their own private garden in a great metropolitan area. It's just not practically possible. But providing access to people on a very affordable basis, on a very local basis. So actually, most weekends in the summer, you can probably walk from your home to an NGS garden anywhere in those metropolitan areas. I think that's very important. And you can do it on a very relaxed basis of entry.
And I suppose, Sam, I'm not sure Tower Hamlets is known as one of the richer parts of parts of London. So you obviously found a way through some of these challenges in your patch.
Yes, I think it was a very innovative local authority who realised that the way to turn around a park was actually give a sense of ownership to the local community and particularly our organisation. And I would give a challenge to any local authority to take any green space like that and ask the question, who owns it and who loves it? And the second thing I'd say is that we've got an allotment garden just around the corner. I live right in the heart of Tower Hamlets. But there's tons of other space, whether it's on roundabouts or virtually anywhere, that could be used for allotment gardens. And I think that is also the challenge to the local authority to say is the roundabout, whatever space it is, how could we turn this into an allotment garden?
I agree, and I have to say as well, the NHS is also sitting on quite a lot of unused land, some of which can be sold, some of which can't. And again, I think that challenge could be placed to a lot of NHS bodies as well as local government.
Well, I think one of Lambeth's, correct me if I'm wrong, Ed, one of the gardens is also on King's College Hospital site. Is that correct, Ed?
Yes, King's College have been very generous in providing the Jenny Lee Garden as their contribution to the Lambeth GP Food Co-op's work. It gives me great pleasure to be taking the Lambeth GP Food Co-op into the Jenny Lee Garden. Those of you who know who Jenny Lee's husband was, we're taking back some of the key values of the NHS back into the service at a time of crisis. But the practical aspect of that is that we work with Corner Surgery, who are located in a corner house. It's a very traditional, old-fashioned surgery without any land whatsoever, and the offer from King's demonstrates a huge goodwill out there on the part of both general practice and the acute to come together to offer unused land for food growing, and that benefits patients. And I'd just like to insert patients back into the conversation. Part of our work is to enable patients to think about self-management as social activity. Gardening can be a very individual activity, as you've described it, but it can also be social activity in which people support each other. The photograph that you saw are for patients from Lambeth Walk surgery. The person in the middle with the hat is the GP. So we have GPs, nurses and patients going out and gardening together, and that breaks down something, and that should be of value in our conversations about workforce in the future. So I just want to re-emphasise that patients are involved actively in managing the work across the borough, as well as being active in growing food. And as David mentioned, that food was sold at King's last month and the month before, and we made a profit, which is then reinvested back into the cooperative. We are a very traditional cooperative, and we think that that is of value to the NHS and wider society. I'm not making a political point, but I'm just saying that that enables patients to feel that they belong to an NHS organisation. And that's a value to all of us.
Thank you. Great, thanks. And Carol, we'll take one more question at the front from Lord Howard.
Michael Howard, Chair of Hospice UK. It would be very remiss, I think, if the hospice movement, which is the largest beneficiary of the largesse of the National Garden Scheme, were not to pay tribute on this occasion to the NGS, and also to bring to everyone's attention the extraordinary part which gardens play in hospices in improving the quality of the end of people's lives. If you want evidence of the remarkable extent to which gardens can improve people's well-being and state of mind, even at what is obviously a very stressful time, you need to look no further than the very many gardens which exist in hospices. And so we both provide the evidence of the extent to which hospices can contribute to well-being and also acknowledge the great benefit we obtain from the National Garden Scheme.